It's glad to have you with us. We're going to Luke 10. So Luke 10, verses 38 to 42 is where we're going to be. A short story, just 5 verses this morning, but really, I think, a helpful story for us today. As we said, the past few weeks we've been thinking about what kind of church do we want to be and what kind of church are we cultivating in this city and on this campus. Luke 10, 38 to 42. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her." Father, thank you for this morning. Be with us now as we open your word. Speak to us and help us see what is the one thing that is necessary in this life. We ask this all in your son's name. Amen. All right, a couple of years ago, I remember coming down into our basement one morning, and I turned the lights on and unexpectedly noticed something strange. All over our basement floor, in just these random little places, there were these little puddles of water all over the floor. The water hadn't come from the ceiling. The ceiling was completely dry. It wasn't coming from the walls. None of the water was touching the walls. It was just these random little puddles all over the basement floor, and it was really weird. And so I got the shop vac out, I cleaned the water up, I dumped it out, figured it was a freak thing, got up the next morning, the same thing happened with a little more water. And so Jesse and I start to look online, what could this be? Maybe it had rained a lot right before that, so maybe this was rainwater getting in, which kind of scared us. Maybe it was summer, and so we thought maybe it was just humid, and that was causing water to pool like that. And so we cleaned it up again, dumped it out. The next day I got up again, more water in more random places. We had a basement specialist come. We had people come and look at the foundation. They were very willing to help us try and figure out what was going on for a lot more money than we wanted to spend. And so we didn't do that. And I was like, I'll just vacuum water every morning for the rest of my life rather than spend that money. The problem was the next day it was more water until it's in the carpet and it's in the walls, and now it's becoming a big problem. But we could not figure out where this water was coming from. One night we were downstairs playing pool with some friends, sitting at a table talking, and we finally saw it happen. We were sitting there talking, and all of a sudden water just started coming up from our concrete basement floor. And we watched this happen over a couple of minutes, and we realized what was happening in that moment, because at that very moment, we live on a well, and the people who owned the house before us bought this like souped up iron filter water softener. It takes up this whole closet in our basement. And every night that water softener would recharge, and in 12 minutes time would run 140 gallons of water through our pipes. Unbeknownst to us, beneath the surface of our basement floor, one of our old 1960s pipes had gotten backed up. And so every night, for who knows how long, 140 gallons of water had been hitting that clog and hitting that clog and hitting that clog until the water had nowhere else to go. And it started to come through the seams in the pipes and through the small cracks in our floors. And so every night, this was where the water was coming from. And so the next morning, we called a plumber. He cleaned the clog out. It was a cheap fix. It was an easy fix. And ever since that beneath the surface problem was taken care of, we hadn't had any more issues. Now, the reason I tell this is because I think it's a helpful picture or a helpful illustration of what happens in discipleship in most churches today. I think this is a helpful picture of what most people experience when they try and grow spiritually. Because what we see is this. I've encountered many Christians who want to get closer to Jesus. They want to spiritually mature. And our natural inclination when we want to begin to get closer to Jesus is this. We throw ourselves into as much spiritual activity as we possibly can. And so in our effort to grow, we go to as many worship services as we can. We join as many ministries as we can. We read all of the latest and greatest Christian books and listen to podcasts and join a small group. And we serve. And all of these are good things. But in an effort to grow, we pack our schedules with as much spiritual activity as possible. And we believe, it seems like, if you look at that process, that through effort and determination, we can force spiritual growth. We can get ourselves to a more mature place. And I'm painting with the broad brush here, but it seems like what the end result of all that spiritual activity for most people is, or at least this was true of me for a long time, is that you can find a lot of people doing a lot of spiritual things, doing a lot of things for Jesus, and yet that hasn't led to much transformation into the image of Christ. That we have people with long spiritual to-do list, but they're not growing in their love for God or other people. Long spiritual to-do list, but they're not progressively looking more and more like Jesus. And if we took a step back this morning and assessed our spiritual lives, how many of us would profess that how we're currently living for Jesus is producing transformation, is changing us and leading us into the image of Christ? Or is the way that we're currently living our spiritual lives leaving us tired and worn out and overextended and spiritually stuck? Again, where all of that effort is not producing what we want it to produce. Again, if most of us assessed what our spiritual lives are producing today, how many of us would say, and some would be able to, I am loving Jesus more. I am loving other people more because of my life with Christ. But if you're here this morning and you're thinking, I am doing a lot, I feel like I'm doing a lot for Jesus. I'm doing the things that Christians are supposed to do. I come to worship. I do all of the stuff that my church asks me to do, and yet I don't feel like I'm changing, then you're not alone in that. And that's where I was for a long time, and I still fight that. Because I think what passes for discipleship in most churches, even in this church at times, is activities that are cleaning up the surface level effects like water on a basement floor of root issues in our hearts that our normal activity can't touch and can't expose and can't heal. Because if we're going to get to a place where real transformation can happen, we have to have the ability, and not many of us do, to go beneath the surface of our lives and deal with things that maybe we haven't seen before, or maybe haven't been exposed before, or haven't seen the light of day before. Issues from growing up, issues from family of origin, issues from things going on in our hearts and minds for years. Because these issues, these core root issues, are not automatically going to be fixed by reading your Bible more, or attending another class, or chasing another spiritual experience, or adding one more thing to your already too long spiritual to-do list. So how do they change? How do we pursue beneath the surface discipleship together? How do we become Christians who actually begin to love Jesus and other people more and are transformed into the image of Christ? Turn with me again to Luke 10, because we see something in this short story of the problem that we find ourselves in. Luke 10:38, now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. For most of Jesus' ministry, he was a traveling preacher, and he was dependent on the hospitality of other people to meet his basic needs, somewhere to sleep, food to eat. And he runs into this woman named Martha one day, who we come to discover is the sister of Lazarus, who Jesus will raise from the dead in John 12. And so Martha welcomes Jesus into her house, and what you discover about Martha fairly quickly is this: incredibly hospitable person. Martha's the kind of person, and we all have people like this, where if that particular person's throwing a dinner party, I want to be at their dinner party because I know it's going to be good. Because Martha does what she has to do to make sure it's comfortable. She takes care of the details. She serves. She pours herself out for the people who come into her house. And she does this for Jesus. She wants his visit to her house to be just right. Think of how hard we work and how stressful it is just to have friends over for dinner. Now imagine Jesus is the one coming over for dinner. How much you would put into making that just right. And so she does that. But, verse 39, we see that her sister Mary had a different perspective on what needed to happen that night. And she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. Now, this story gives us two different pictures of how these women were experiencing Jesus on this night. First, there's Martha, who is running herself ragged, trying to make sure that Jesus has a good visit to her house. She's making sure everything gets done, that everyone has what they need. But then there's Mary, who's simply sitting at Jesus' feet and listening to him. And you can imagine, as Martha's getting everything done, that when she sees Mary just sitting there, she gets a little angry. I don't know if you've ever experienced this. Don't look at the person next to you right now. Where you're hard at work trying to get things done around the house, and you walk through the living room, and there's your spouse, there's your roommate, there's your kid, sitting on the couch, bag of chips, not a care in the world, watching TV, and rather than simply asking them for help, what do? Maybe you start to clean a little louder, hoping they'll hear what you're doing and offer to help. Maybe you take, some of you, I've done this, where I would normally take one load of clothes from the laundry room to put them away, you begin to take them piece by piece, to pass by the living room as many times as possible, as loudly as possible, hoping they see the sweat, hoping they see how hard you're working. And this is where Martha is. She's doing it all. Mary's just sitting there, and she gets so frustrated, she does a pretty unthinkable thing. She tells Jesus what to do. And she goes to Jesus and says, Jesus, tell my sister to help me. And it seems like a respectable request. And we could imagine Jesus looking at Mary and saying, Mary, there'll be time for this after dinner. Why don't you go help your sister and then come back and sit at my feet? But that's not how Jesus responds. Look at what he says in verse 41. The Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you're anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion which will not be taken away from her. Now, if we're being honest, Jesus' response should surprise us a little bit here because Martha's doing everything she can to serve Jesus. This is for him. She's wearing herself out to make sure that he's comfortable and has what he needs, and Mary's just sitting there. If Jesus should be frustrated with anyone, it should be Mary. Why isn't she helping? But that's not how Jesus responds here. He tells Martha that she should actually try and be a little bit more like her sister Mary. And in fact, he tells Martha, Mary has chosen the better thing in this moment. Because in the midst of all of Martha's activity, in spite of everything she's doing for Jesus, she's missed the most important thing here. She's missed that rather than doing everything she can for Jesus, what she needs more than that is to be with Jesus, which is what Mary's doing here. This is an incredibly important lesson for us to learn in this story, given the culture that we find ourselves in and the place in history that we find ourselves. Because what we learn in this story is that it's possible to busy ourselves with lots of things, even good things. Waiting on Jesus at this house party was good work, hospitable work, but we can do so much good work and have so much constant activity in our lives, we can miss the point entirely of what life with Jesus is supposed to be. Again, some of us are so busy trying to do things for Jesus and for other people, we forget to slow down and spend time in the presence of Jesus. And again, for a certain segment of this church, this is going to be an important lesson to learn because we live in a culture that values activity. And we live in a culture that values grinding and being as productive as possible and being as efficient as possible. And we spend lots of time and effort trying to learn, how can I wake up a little bit earlier? How can I pack a little more in? How can I get a little bit more done? How can I take my already overextended to-do list and shove more into it? And yet what we find here is Jesus imploring us that there is a different way to live. That you can imagine many in our culture going to Mary and saying, you'll have time to sit at Jesus' feet when you're dead, get up and get to work. And yet that's not what Mary's doing here. Another way to put this is this. This is an important lesson for us to learn because we live in a culture that highly values what we do compared to who we are. And it's exactly at this point that we're beginning to bump up into the issue of how transformation actually takes place in the Christian life. Because again, if we're constantly so busy and doing so much, even good things, which, side note, when the elders reviewed the annual surveys that you guys turned in, the number one issue people were facing in this church as simple as it sounds, was just this: I'm too busy. I have too much going on. It's a constant. You're not alone if you're feeling that. If we see this, it's this point we begin to bump into this, that if we're so busy that we have no time to be in the presence of Jesus, where transformation actually takes place, it shouldn't surprise us when our spiritual growth feels stunted. Now, to be clear, what Martha was doing was good. This was good work she was doing. And in the Christian life, there is work that has to be done. When you read through the Bible, there's lots for Christians to do. Lots of needs to meet, lots of ways to serve, lots of ways to use our spiritual gifts. Jesus isn't saying Christians should be lazy and ignore all their obligations and just spend time in his presence. But there's a balance here. Because if all of our activity for Jesus is causing us to miss out on intimacy with Jesus, we've missed the point of everything that we're doing. Because as we noted a few weeks ago, one of the central goals of the Christian life, if not the central goal, is to learn to abide in the presence of Jesus. This is John 15:4, a verse we've come back to over and over again in the past few weeks. Look at what Jesus says again: abide in me and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Now, this is a helpful verse because in it we actually see both aspects of the Christian life, the being in the presence of Jesus part and the active doing stuff part. Because Jesus tells his followers they should expect to produce fruit. They should expect life change. They should expect to see things getting accomplished in and through their lives. To see people coming to meet Jesus through their witness. To see people being served and helped by the giftedness that we bring into our relationships. There should be some outward sign or some activity that points to the reality that someone is a Christian. That is a part of this. But look at what Jesus says about the fruit. This fruit is a product of abiding in Christ. This fruit should be the overflow or the outgrowth of time spent in the presence of Jesus. And often we get this backwards because we tell ourselves, I'm going to do more for Jesus, and if I do more for Jesus, then I'll get closer to him. And Jesus turns that idea on its head and says, no, get closer to me, and then you'll see the fruit produced. And this is backward from every other way that we accomplish something in this world. And that's why this is so hard to get. Because anything else you want to accomplish in this life, you do accomplish it through hard work and effort. If you want good grades, you got to study more. If you want a raise or a promotion, you got to put more hours in and do the jobs other people won't do. If you want to get in better shape, more time in the gym, just across the board. If you want something in this life, 9 times out of 10, time and effort and intensity is going to get that for you. And yet, when we come to this issue of spiritual growth, which it's only natural that we would bring that process into this part of our lives, we come to discover that Jesus actually turns this idea on its head, and that the path to spiritual maturity isn't like the path to worldly success. In fact, it's the opposite. Because what if the path to spiritual maturity, as we look at ideas like Luke 10 and John 15, involved actually doing less, involved saying no more, involved fighting against a longer to-do list so that we actually have time to be in the presence of Jesus? What if we pursued getting to a place where, in the words of Pastor Pete Scazzaro, our active life in the world for God flows from a deep inner life with God? This is the John 15 model here. I really do believe it's this conscious, or often for many people, unconscious decision to refuse to slow down, to refuse to tune out some of the noise around us, to refuse to sit at Jesus' feet, that is leading to a church filled with people, myself included, who do a lot of things for God, but who experience little beneath the surface transformation. For a long time in my Christian life, one of the hardest things for me to reconcile was this, is that I could intensely pursue certain disciplines in the Christian life, reading my Bible, praying, going to church, the normal things that are supposed to produce growth. And yet when I looked at my life outside of the church, I still I found myself saying things I didn't want to say, being a person I didn't want to be. It felt like who I actually was and what I was pursuing in the spiritual world was constantly disjointed. And that's not to say Christians have to be perfect. We want to be holy as God is holy, but there's going to be some element of imperfection in that. But I felt this just deep disconnect between who I was 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and who I was trying to be in those moments of spiritual effort. And maybe it's not you, but if you spend enough time in the church, you'll discover people who are also experiencing this disconnect somewhere, where maybe they have a solid understanding of the Bible and Christian doctrine, and yet they remain a detached spouse or an angry parent. Where they function as leaders in the church, but they remain unteachable and insecure and defensive. Where they can quote the Bible with relative ease, and yet they're not aware of how reactive they are to the people around them. Maybe they pray and even fast regularly, but they remain overly critical of others. Or people who want to do great things for God, but primarily they're motivated by an unhealthy need to be liked or to obtain power. People who serve tirelessly in the church and yet carry resentment and bitterness toward others because they refuse to deal with the conflict in their life and the relationships in their life. We've all been there and we've all seen it. Now, just to be clear again, I'm sure plenty of people could highlight those disconnects in my own life. And again, we're not saying Christians need to be perfect, but it seems like it's possible to do a lot of things for God, to have a lot of spiritual activity in our lives, and yet those issues beneath the surface at a heart level, for those to remain largely untouched by all of our effort. And so the question is, how do we get beneath the surface to the root issues that are going to produce real change in our lives? Again, maybe you're sitting here this morning, and if you were just honest, you would say, I've been in church for years. I've been reading the Bible for years. But if I'm being honest, my love for God and other people has not grown in that period of time. These things that I'm wrestling with inside have not changed over that period of time. And for all of our doing and striving, maybe your interior world still feels chaotic and out of control. And if that's you this morning, you're not alone, and it's you and me that Jesus looks at today in the midst of that realization and says to us, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Because in order for us to finally see true and lasting transformation in our lives, we must begin to prioritize time in the presence of Jesus. Again, as we've said the past few weeks, this isn't an invitation from Jesus to completely withdraw from the world. We have obligations in this life. We have people who need us. We have things that need to get done. If you're a college student, please don't make the decision today based on this sermon that Pastor Eric said I need more time with Jesus, and call your parents and tell them I dropped out of school and I'm going to be alone for a while and they've dropped $100,000 on your education. I don't want that phone call this week, so don't make that kind of decision. The question is, in the midst of all our doing, how do we cultivate intimacy? How do we cultivate time in the presence of Christ? Because if all of our activity is not flowing from a deep inner life with Jesus, it is activity that's ultimately going to leave us frustrated and tired and bitter and unchanged. Because it takes those quiet moments of solitude with Christ where we can turn off the noise around us and spend some time focusing on the root issues beneath the surface that are actually stunting our spiritual growth. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. We get all the way through the sermon, real transformation where it can take place. Is the conclusion really real transformation will begin to take place if I just have a quiet time every day? If I just read my Bible and pray? I've been doing that for years. If I just do that every day, is that what you were saying is going to lead to transformation? And I want to be clear, that's not what I'm saying. Because I can remember years of my life where I would do that. I had my Bible reading chart for the year, and I was consistent in Bible reading. And after I finished my Bible reading, I would bring my prayer requests to God, and I would do these things day after day after day. And yet, I remained unchanged by what seemed like time in the presence of Jesus. So what are we talking about here? One of the things I had to reflect back on was this, is that often that time in the presence of Jesus I was trying to cultivate, by and large, was something I was checking off a to-do list, and once I closed my Bible or left that time of prayer, I largely left the presence of God and wasn't factoring Him into my normal everyday life. And the other thing I discovered was this, and this gets to the heart of the issue, is that when I would come to those quiet moments with Jesus, when I'd open my Bible, when I'd try to pray, I was setting aside how I was actually feeling in that moment, what I was actually experiencing in that moment, what I felt like on the inside. I was setting that over here. I was coming to read my Bible and pray because those aren't holy things, those aren't holy feelings, and I would have this time with Jesus. But then when I would leave that time with Jesus, I would take back on my shoulders all of those things I was feeling, all of those things I was worried about, all of those things I was anxious about. And what I came to discover was this: you can have a quiet time with Jesus and not bring your whole self into the presence of Jesus. You can have a structured quiet time with Jesus and not come into His presence open and honest and vulnerable and ready to hear from the Lord and allow Him to do a work in you. And if it's just to check something off a to-do list, that is not going to produce transformation. But when I'm able to have an honest moment in the presence of Jesus, that is where things begin to change. When's the last time you had an honest moment with God? When you came into the presence of God and you allowed yourself to say, God, I am angry and I'm angry at you. God, I'm frustrated and I don't know why. God, I know I'm supposed to love this person, but I don't, and I don't know that I can get over it. These moments where we do come in reverence before God, but we're willing to be open and honest about where we're at, not set it to the side. God, I'm frustrated. I'm scared. I'm bitter. God, I've got these things going on inside of me that I don't want to let go of. Until we're willing to bring that into the presence of Jesus, we shouldn't expect heart-level transformation from that time, because if we're not willing to bring that into Jesus' presence, then those are things we're not allowing Him to heal and to put His hands on and to change inside of us. Again, for some reason, we've come to the idea that we can't bring what we're actually feeling into the presence of God because, to some degree, our feelings are sub-Christian or unchristian, or they can deceive us, and so we need to set our emotions aside. And yet, when you read through the Bible about the relationship with God that men and women of faith had, they were incredibly open and honest relationships that they had with God. Again, how could you read Job's intense questions as he cries out to God in the midst of his suffering? Or Moses' frustration before God with Israel as he tried to lead them and they remained rebellious? Or Jeremiah's depression or David's raw emotion in the Psalms as he cries out to God when God feels distant, and think that God can't handle our feelings or doesn't want us to bring our feelings to Him? I mentioned this author last week, but Brennan Manning writes, our emotions are our most direct reaction to our perception of ourselves and the world around us. And because of that, they're not things to cut off from our relationship with God. They are things to bring into our relationship with God, to give us a starting point for, God, this is what I'm feeling. This is where I need help. This is what I'm struggling with, and to be open and honest in His presence. Again, somewhere along the way, many Christians divorced spiritual maturity and their emotions, and we've been paying a price for it ever since. Because more often than not, when I'm feeling something deeply, that is putting our fingers on something that Jesus needs to change, or Jesus needs to heal, or Jesus needs to deal with. And rather than ignoring our emotions, we begin to see them as the place where God wants to meet us and do the greatest work in us. Again, when I'm willing to come before God and say, God, I'm angry with this person, and I have been for years, and I can't let it go, that's where transformation can begin to take place. God, I'm bitter because you let this happen in my life, and I haven't fully trusted you since. That's where transformation can begin to take place. And as easy as that sounds, learning to bring our whole selves into the presence of God as we truly are is one of the most, if not the most important things we can learn to do as followers of Jesus. Because as I'm bringing these things to God, I'm asking beneath the surface questions. Why am I angry? Why am I bitter? Why am I refusing to let go of these things? And these are the kinds of questions that can lead us to a place where we can ask God for the help that we actually need to be made new, or have the conversations with other people that we actually need to have. But when we're so busy that we don't even allow ourselves to have a moment to breathe and to feel the things that we're feeling, it's no wonder the deepest areas of our heart and mind that need the healing touch of Jesus aren't being transformed. Jesus wants us to sit at his feet, but not in a divided way, not in a distracted way. He wants us to bring our whole selves into his presence and to begin to minister to that whole person as we sit at the feet of Jesus. And this requires time and humility and vulnerability. But this is the place where we can stop doing so much that we distract ourselves from what's actually happening inside of us and invite Jesus to meet us in those places. Now we're about to wrap up, but before we do, it's worth pointing out, if this is something we're wanting to step into, what are some practical things we can do? One is easy, one's a lot harder. The easy one is this. We do have to make a decision. We're going to be people who create space for time in the presence of Jesus in our lives. And that may require a total rewiring or break from life as we know it, where we're going to push some things off of our plate, where we're going to say no to some things, maybe even some good things, to create this margin and cultivate this space, where we have to have the conviction time in the presence of Jesus is what's going to begin to heal me, or to at least expose what needs healed in my life. And so I have to have space for this in my life. Unhurried, undistracted, Mary-like, sitting at the feet of Jesus and enjoying his presence. And the second thing is this, and if you had told me 10 years ago I was about to preach this sermon, I would have laughed, because I never would have assumed these words would come out of my mouth. For some of us, and we were joking at the elders retreat, as the senior pastor of this church, I tend to attract a certain kind of person. I feel like I know some of you pretty well. One of the most important things you will do for your relationship with Jesus in the coming years is this. You will learn how to feel your feelings. Because until you do, your spiritual growth is going to be stunted. Again, many of us have decided that we need to divorce our emotional world, our internal world, from our spiritual lives, because our emotions can be sinful. Our emotions can be deceptive, and they can. But that doesn't make them any less real. And it's only when we allow ourselves to feel what we're feeling, and not just to sit in it, but to bring it into the presence of God and ask for his help and work it out in counseling and work it out in conversations with other people, that we're going to begin to experience some of this beneath the surface change. And when you begin to integrate these things, your knowledge of God and your life in the real world, your head and your heart, when you come together as a whole person into the presence of Jesus, that's where this begins to take place. Again, what if the only way that we're going to be able to draw near to Christ and experience this change is maybe the first step is this: we have to get a better handle on who we are. Not selfish introspection, but coming to this realization: until I know myself, what I'm feeling, how I work, what's inside of me, I'm not going to be able to bring my full self into the presence of Jesus. This was the encouragement of Augustine over 1,000 years ago. When the church father Augustine wrote, "How can you draw close to God when you are far from your own self? Grant, Lord, that I may know myself." But don't stop there, "that I may know you." Or in the words of Teresa of Avila, almost all problems in the spiritual life stem from a lack of self-knowledge. Again, unless we're willing to do the hard work of figuring out who we are, we won't know what we need from Jesus. We won't know what actually needs healed in our hearts and deep in our souls. And so the question is, well, how do we begin to figure this out? Well, it's worth asking, how well do we feel like we know ourselves? How well can you articulate what's going on inside of you at a given moment? And I will just confess, I'm really bad at this. I used to be really bad at it. I've gotten a little better with 10 years of counseling. That the first few years that Jesse and I were married, she would ask me how I was doing, and I would begin to list off all of the things that I had done that day. And she would say, "No, how are you doing?" And it was a question I didn't understand. I didn't have words to answer her. And so we would have this constant frustration that I couldn't share that. And so a few years back, I got into counseling, and there were some things in the church that needed work. There were some things in my family that needed work. And I assumed I'm going to go to this counselor, tell him my problems. He'll fix it. He'll give me the plan to work. I'll work the plan, and everything will be better. What I wasn't ready for was the end of one of our first sessions together was where he said, "All right, here's what I want you to do. Here's your assignment." And I'm excited. I'm thinking, here comes the plan, the process, the steps. Tell me what to do. How do I fix these things? And I wasn't ready for this. He said, "Every day I want you to get a piece of paper." I said, "Great, I can do that." Okay. And I want you to put the date on it. So far, so good. And every day underneath the date, I want you to draw a smiley face. And all you're going to draw is how you felt that day. And I know you don't have the words for it, so you're going to do it in a smiley face. You're going to make him frown. You're going to make him smile. You're going to put a tear. You're going to have him laughing. However creative you want to get. And I looked, me, an adult man at that time, looked at another adult man and said, "Are you asking me to keep a feelings journal?" I never thought I would ask somebody that. And he said, "Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing." And it was, as easy as that sounds for some of you, the most painful moment of my day. To sit down and draw that. I felt so stupid drawing that face and just every day looking at it. And even the next step was, all right, I want you to look at that face, and then I want you to say, "I felt sad today." And I was like, I'm a first grader. Why are we doing this? But I did it, and I did it, and I did it. And here's what I come to discover. It began to change me. Because I was beginning to profess things I had never professed about myself before. I was beginning to recognize things inside of me I had never recognized before. And not only was it benefiting me personally, I was beginning to love other people better. Because as I discovered that I have emotions, I had the thought, oh, maybe other people do too. And I need to care for them in that. I still remember how big of a deal this was came home to me. My wife and I were in a fight. We don't fight much, but we're married. We fight from time to time. And for years, I had never been able to tell her when she was making me mad or I was frustrated by her. And I remember I had been doing my smiley faces, and we were doing this whole thing, and we got in this fight, and I remember we were frustrated with each other, and I looked at her one day, and I said, "Jesse, I'm so frustrated with you right now." And as I said, the words were leaving my mouth. It felt very unnatural to me. And I braced for what was next. And my wife got a big smile on her face. And she hugged me, and she said, "Honey, I'm so happy. Because in all of our years of marriage, you've never told me that." And I was like, "Well, maybe I'll tell you I'm frustrated all the time if this is how this is going to go." But I began, for years, she had no idea what was happening. And as I began to integrate that piece of my life, my relationships began to change. And the way I related to God began to change. But it required me to feel what I'm feeling. And more to that, I was able to pinpoint the root issues I needed to bring to God. I needed to bring to a counselor. Maybe some of you need counseling. I needed to bring to friends who could help heal those things in me. But in order for those things to be healed, they had to be brought to the light. And in order to bring them to the light, I had to know they were there, and I had to be willing to say that these things are a part of me. And what we're encouraged by as we close is this, is that Jesus is inviting you into his presence today, not fearful of your emotions, not resistant to your emotions, not waiting for you to say the wrong thing and then he's going to leave you. No, he's inviting you to bring your whole self into his presence, because it's in bringing your whole self into his presence that your whole self can be healed and redeemed and transformed. And if you're struggling to find the words, just begin to pray the Psalms, and you'll find yourself saying some things to God you never thought you would say to God, because there is a realness and a rawness to those prayers that we're often lacking. And again, as we get ready to sing, what would happen if we became a church filled with people willing to be open, to be vulnerable, to be honest with God and with others? It's going to be painful, it's going to be messy, but it might also be the path to having God transform what's happening in us beneath the surface, and maybe some sins, maybe some issues, maybe some wounds that have stuck with us for years could finally be healed if we're just willing to be open and honest about who we are and where we're at in the presence of God, seeking the grace of God. I'll pray and we'll sing.